Welcome back to History 3011. Today we're traveling back to one of the darkest mornings in American history, a morning that lasted only 2 hours, yet changed the course of the 20th century forever. A morning when thousands of lives were lost, a nation was pulled into World War II, and the balance of global power shifted forever. This is the true story of Pearl Harbor. December the 7th, 1941. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sun slowly climbed above the Pacific Ocean. Palm trees moved gently in the warm tropical breeze. The waters of Pearl Harbor were perfectly calm. Rows of powerful American battleships rested peacefully at anchor. For the young sailors aboard them, it felt like any other weekend. Some were finishing breakfast, others were cleaning the decks. A few stood watching the beautiful Hawaiian sunrise. No one imagined that within minutes, their lives would change forever. More than 200 miles north of Hawaii, hidden beyond the horizon, a powerful Japanese naval fleet moved silently across the Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of highly trained sailors and pilots, all moving under complete radio silence. The mission had been planned for months. Every detail had been rehearsed. Every pilot knew exactly where to fly, exactly which ship to attack, exactly how much destruction to cause. Inside the Japanese carriers, pilots gathered for one final briefing. Maps of Pearl Harbor covered the walls. The room was silent. No speeches, no celebrations, only quiet determination. Then the signal was given, one by one. The aircraft engines roared to life. Fighter planes, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers lifted into the dark morning sky. Within minutes, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were flying toward Hawaii. At nearly the same time, an American radar station on Oahu detected something unusual, a massive group of aircraft approaching from the north. Young radar operators stared at their screens in confusion. The formation was enormous, but they believed it was probably a scheduled flight of American bombers expected to arrive that morning. No warning was issued, no alarm was sounded. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force continued closing the distance. High above the clouds, the pilots finally saw the Hawaiian Islands appear beneath them. Pearl Harbor lay directly ahead. The harbor still looked peaceful. Battleships remained perfectly lined up. American flags waved gently in the morning breeze. Everything was exactly as the attackers had hoped. Inside one Japanese cockpit, a pilot looked down at the sleeping fleet. His hand slowly moved toward the weapon release controls. The attack was only seconds away. History had reached the point where there was no turning back. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the first bombs began to fall, and in a single moment, America's peaceful Sunday morning disappeared forever. But how could one of the world's strongest naval bases be caught completely by surprise? The answer would unfold over the next 2 devastating hours. Welcome back to History 3011. Today we're traveling back to one of the darkest mornings in American history, a morning that lasted only 2 hours, yet changed the course of the 20th century forever. A morning when thousands of lives were lost. A nation was pulled into World War II, and the balance of global power shifted forever. This is the true story of Pearl Harbor. December the 7th, 1941. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sun slowly climbed above the Pacific Ocean. Palm trees moved gently in the warm tropical breeze. The waters of Pearl Harbor were perfectly calm. Rows of powerful American battleships rested peacefully at anchor. For the young sailors aboard them, it felt like any other weekend. Some were finishing breakfast, others were cleaning the decks. A few stood watching the beautiful Hawaiian sunrise. No one imagined that within minutes, their lives would change forever. More than 200 miles north of Hawaii, hidden beyond the horizon. A powerful Japanese naval fleet moved silently across the Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of highly trained sailors and pilots, all moving under complete radio silence. The mission had been planned for months. Every detail had been rehearsed. Every pilot knew exactly where to fly, exactly which ship to attack, exactly how much destruction to cause. Inside the Japanese carriers, pilots gathered for one final briefing. Maps of Pearl Harbor covered the walls. The room was silent. No speeches, no celebrations, only quiet determination. Then the signal was given, one by one. The aircraft engines roared to life. Fighter planes, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers lifted into the dark morning sky. Within minutes, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were flying toward Hawaii. At nearly the same time, an American radar station on Oahu detected something unusual, a massive group of aircraft approaching from the north. Young radar operators stared at their screens in confusion. The formation was enormous, but they believed it was probably a scheduled flight of American bombers expected to arrive that morning. No warning was issued, no alarm was sounded. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike force continued closing the distance. High above the clouds, the pilots finally saw the Hawaiian Islands appear beneath them. Pearl Harbor lay directly ahead. The harbor still looked peaceful. Battleships remained perfectly lined up. American flags waved gently in the morning breeze. Everything was exactly as the attackers had hoped. Inside one Japanese cockpit, a pilot looked down at the sleeping fleet. His hand slowly moved toward the weapon release controls. The attack was only seconds away. History had reached the point where there was no turning back. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the first bombs began to fall, and in a single moment, America's peaceful Sunday morning disappeared forever. But how could one of the world's strongest naval bases be caught completely by surprise? The answer would unfold over the next 2 devastating hours. The attack wasn't over. Even as thick black smoke rose above Pearl Harbor, a second wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Hawaii. Their mission was simple: finish what the first wave had started. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds. Machine guns echoed across the harbor. Explosions shook the docks once again. But this time, America was fighting back. Across the harbor, anti-aircraft guns opened fire from every direction. Young sailors who had never seen combat only minutes earlier were now loading shells, aiming at enemy aircraft, and firing as fast as humanly possible. The sky became a battlefield. Black clouds of anti-aircraft explosions surrounded the attacking planes. Japanese pilots who had expected little resistance suddenly found themselves flying through a storm of gunfire. Several aircraft were hit. Some trailed thick smoke as they struggled to escape. Others disappeared into the ocean below. Meanwhile, one American battleship refused to surrender. USS Nevada, despite suffering bomb damage, managed to get underway. Its crew hoped to sail out of Pearl Harbor and reach open water. For a brief moment, it looked like they might succeed, but Japanese aircraft quickly noticed the moving battleship. They concentrated their attack on USS Nevada, hoping to sink her in the harbor entrance and trap the entire American fleet. Bomb after bomb exploded nearby. Smoke covered the deck. Still, her crew continued fighting. Eventually, the decision was made to deliberately beach the battleship along the shoreline to prevent the harbor from being completely blocked. Even in defeat, the crew had protected the fleet. Away from the harbor, military hospitals were already overflowing. Doctors, nurses, and Navy corpsmen worked without rest. Operating rooms filled almost instantly. Hallways became emergency treatment centers. Stretchers covered every available floor. Despite exhaustion, medical teams refused to stop. Outside the naval base, families living in Honolulu looked toward the horizon in disbelief. The sky above Pearl Harbor had turned completely black with smoke. Parents held their children close. Nobody knew whether another attack was coming. Fear spread across the Hawaiian Islands. Finally, shortly before 10 o'clock, the last Japanese aircraft turned north. The attack was over. The silence that followed felt almost unreal, where peaceful battleships had rested only 2 hours earlier. Burning wrecks now filled the harbor. Oil floated across the water. Rescue boats searched endlessly for survivors. Photographers and military officers began documenting the destruction. The numbers were almost impossible to believe. More than 2,400 Americans had been killed. Over 1,000 were wounded. 8 battleships had been damaged or sunk. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed. It was one of the darkest mornings in American history. Yet, as smoke continued rising into the Hawaiian sky, one symbol remained standing. The American flag still flew over Pearl Harbor. It had survived the attack, and for millions of Americans, it became a promise. The nation had been wounded, but it had not been defeated. The following day, all eyes turned to Washington, D.C. What President Franklin D. Roosevelt was about to say would unite an entire nation and officially change the course of World War II forever. On the morning of December 8, 1941, less than 24 hours after the attack, Washington, D.C. had become the center of the world's attention. Inside the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat quietly at his desk. Reports from Pearl Harbor covered every inch of the table. Lists of damaged battleships, casualty reports, military intelligence, photographs of the destruction. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours, but its consequences would shape the next 4 years of world history. Roosevelt knew that every word he spoke next would be remembered for generations. With a fountain pen in his hand, he carefully revised the speech he would soon deliver before Congress. It was not a long speech, but every sentence carried extraordinary weight. As lawmakers gathered inside the United States Capitol, journalists filled the galleries, radio microphones were prepared, millions of Americans waited anxiously beside their radios. The nation wanted answers. The nation wanted leadership. Then, President Roosevelt entered the House chamber. The room fell completely silent. He looked across Congress, paused for a brief moment, and began with words that would become some of the most famous in American history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Those words echoed across the country, families listening from living rooms, factory workers gathered around radios, soldiers standing at military bases. Everyone understood what they meant. America had been attacked, and America would respond. When Roosevelt finished speaking, Congress wasted little time. The vote was overwhelming. The United States officially declared war on Japan. For millions of Americans, World War II was no longer a distant conflict happening across oceans. It had become their war, across the nation. Recruitment offices filled almost immediately. Young men stood in long lines waiting to enlist. Many carried nothing more than a small suitcase and a determination to serve. Some hugged their parents, others kissed their wives and children goodbye. Many believed they would be home within months. Few realized the war would last nearly 4 years. Meanwhile, American factories transformed almost overnight. Automobile plants began producing military trucks. Civilian factories built the fighter aircraft. Shipyards worked 24 hours a day constructing destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. Millions of women entered factories, helping produce the equipment that would support American forces around the world. The entire nation united behind a single purpose: win the war. Back at Pearl Harbor, smoke still drifted above the harbor. The wreckage remained. The scars of the attack were visible everywhere, but above the destruction, the American flag continued to fly. It became more than a symbol. It became a promise that the attack would never be forgotten, and a promise that America would fight until victory was achieved. Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant. Now, the world was about to witness what that giant could do. But while America prepared for war, Japan believed it had achieved one of the greatest military victories in history. What happened next would surprise both nations and change the entire Pacific War forever. As America mobilized for war, many people believed Japan had achieved a complete victory. Pearl Harbor was burning. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled. Across Japan, military leaders celebrated what appeared to be a flawless operation. But one man remained cautious. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant naval strategist who had planned the attack. Unlike many around him, Yamamoto understood America. He had studied there. He knew its factories, its industries, and its enormous ability to recover. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but Yamamoto feared it had created a far more dangerous enemy. History remembers a warning often associated with him, that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. Whether those exact words were spoken remains debated by historians, but the idea reflected his real concern. He knew the United States would not surrender. It would fight harder than ever. Meanwhile, inside the White House, President Roosevelt and America's military commanders searched for a way to strike back. The American people needed hope. The world needed to know that the United States could still fight. Then came an idea that many believed was impossible: launch Army bombers from an aircraft carrier. It had never been attempted in combat before. The mission would become known as the Doolittle Raid. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers were loaded onto the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The pilots knew the risks. Most understood they might never return home. Yet not a single volunteer stepped back. On the morning of April 18th, 1942, the aircraft carrier was discovered earlier than expected by Japanese patrol vessels. There was only one choice: launch immediately. Even though the bombers were still hundreds of miles farther from Japan than originally planned. One after another, the bombers thundered down the carrier deck. The runway was incredibly short. The Pacific Ocean waited only a few feet beyond the bow. Every takeoff demanded absolute precision. Against all odds, every bomber became airborne. Hours later, American aircraft appeared over Tokyo. For the first time in history, enemy bombers flew above the Japanese capital. Military factories, warehouses, and strategic facilities became targets. The physical damage was limited, but psychologically, the impact was enormous. Japan suddenly realized its home islands were no longer untouchable. Across the United States, newspaper headlines celebrated the daring raid. For a nation still recovering from Pearl Harbor, the mission became a powerful symbol of hope. It proved that America had not been defeated. It was only getting started. For Japan, the raid had another consequence. Its military leaders became determined to destroy America's remaining aircraft carriers once and for all. That decision would soon lead both navies toward a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, a place called Midway. Neither side realized it yet, but the battle waiting there would change the course of World War II forever. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, two of the world's greatest navies would collide near a small island called Midway. In only a few hours, the balance of the Pacific War would be turned upside down. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become the most dangerous battlefield on Earth. Both Japan and the United States knew that another major naval battle was inevitable. The question was, who would strike first? Thanks to American codebreakers, U.S. intelligence achieved one of the greatest successes of the war. Hidden messages sent by the Japanese Navy had been partially deciphered, again and again. One mysterious target appeared in the intercepted communications. It was identified only as AF. American intelligence suspected that AF meant Midway Atoll, a tiny island nearly halfway between Hawaii and Japan. But they needed proof, so they came up with a clever plan. Midway sent an unencrypted radio message claiming its freshwater system had failed. Hours later, Japanese radio transmissions reported that AF is short of water. The mystery was solved. The next Japanese attack would target Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz immediately prepared a trap. Instead of waiting to defend Midway, he secretly positioned America's aircraft carriers northeast of the island. The Japanese believed they still held the advantage. They had no idea that American carriers were already waiting. At dawn on June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. American scout aircraft searched endlessly across thousands of square miles of open ocean. Hours passed. Fuel gauges dropped. Some pilots feared they had missed the enemy entirely. Then, a single scout radioed the words every commander had hoped to hear. Enemy carriers sighted. Almost immediately, American aircraft launched into the sky. Fighter escorts, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers. All raced toward the Japanese fleet. The first attacks did not go well. Several American torpedo squadrons flew directly into overwhelming enemy defenses. Without fighter protection, many aircraft were shot down. Crew after crew sacrificed everything, simply to keep the attack alive. Their bravery came at an enormous cost. But those attacks achieved something unexpected. Japanese fighter aircraft descended to low altitude to intercept them. Carrier decks became crowded with aircraft preparing for another strike. Fuel hoses stretched across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed. At that exact moment, high above the clouds, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers finally arrived. The Japanese fleet never saw them coming. The pilots rolled into near-vertical dives. Sirens echoed through the cockpits. The carriers grew larger with every passing second. Then, the bombs were released. Within only a few minutes, massive explosions erupted across the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Fuel ignited instantly. Armed aircraft exploded where they stood. Towering columns of black smoke climbed into the Pacific sky. 3 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers were burning. Only one carrier, Hiryu, remained operational. It launched one desperate counterattack against the American fleet. But by the end of the day, Hiryu too had been found, bombed, and left burning. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and many of its most experienced naval aviators. It was a defeat from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully recover. The Battle of Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the momentum had shifted. America was no longer fighting to survive. America was beginning to win. Pearl Harbor had awakened America. Midway had changed the war, but the road to victory was still long. Ahead lay Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final battles that would decide the fate of the Pacific and the world. The victory at Midway marked a turning point, but the war in the Pacific was far from over. For the next 3 years, American forces fought across thousands of miles of ocean, island by island, beach by beach. The campaign became known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese stronghold, American commanders carefully selected key islands. Each victory brought them closer to Japan itself. The fighting was brutal. Dense jungles, volcanic beaches, relentless heat, and determined resistance made every landing a test of courage. Then came one of the most iconic battles of World War II, Iwo Jima. After weeks of intense fighting, a small group of United States Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. Together, they raised the American flag. A photograph captured that single moment. It quickly became one of the most famous images in military history. For millions of Americans, it symbolized sacrifice, determination, and hope. But the road to victory demanded even more. The Battle of Okinawa became the largest and bloodiest battle fought in the Pacific. Both sides suffered enormous losses. By the summer of 1945, Japan's military situation had become desperate. Its navy was shattered, its air power was fading, its cities had been devastated by years of war. Finally, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's decision to surrender. A few weeks later, representatives from Japan boarded the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. There, the official surrender documents were signed. World War II had finally come to an end. Across the United States, church bells rang, factory whistles echoed through cities, families embraced at the streets, Times Square filled with cheering crowds. For millions of Americans, the war was over, yet even in celebration, no one forgot where the journey had begun. Pearl Harbor. Today, the waters of Pearl Harbor are peaceful once again. The USS Arizona Memorial rests above the sunken battleship, where more than 1,000 American sailors still remain. Visitors from around the world stand quietly above the white memorial, not to celebrate war, but to remember the lives forever changed on that Sunday morning. History often turns on moments that seem impossible to predict. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, America believed it was at peace. Just 2 hours later, the nation had entered one of the greatest conflicts in human history. Pearl Harbor was more than a surprise attack. It reshaped the 20th century, changed global politics, and transformed the United States into a leading world power. More than 80 years later, its lessons still remind us how quickly peace can disappear, and how courage, unity, and determination can change the course of history. Thank you for watching History 3011. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more true stories that changed America and the world, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop exploring history.